Every Thursday morning, just after 7 o'clock, an old flatbed truck leaves the county highway and slowly makes its way down a narrow gravel road in rural Kentucky before stopping beside a 40-acre property that has stood almost unchanged for decades. The driver never blows the horn because he already knows someone is waiting. Standing beside the weathered porch with a steaming cup of black coffee in one hand is 72-year-old Elias Mercer, a retired civil engineer whose quiet routine has barely changed since leaving the profession nearly 10 years earlier. He watches patiently as the truck backs toward the fence line and begins unloading thick, uneven oak slabs covered with rough bark, twisted grain, deep cracks, and irregular edges. They are the kind of boards commercial lumber companies reject without a second thought, the kind usually burned for fuel, chipped into mulch, or hauled away to landfills because they cannot meet the uniform standards demanded by cabinet factories and flooring manufacturers. Yet every single Thursday, Elias welcomes another load as though he has been expecting something precious instead of industrial waste. Week after week, the piles continue to grow along the old easement running beside his property, and before long, the unusual deliveries begin attracting attention throughout the surrounding countryside. Curious neighbors start parking along the roadside near his mailbox just to watch another shipment arrive. Some lean against their pickup trucks, whispering among themselves, while others simply shake their heads, unable to understand why a retired engineer would willingly fill his land with truckloads of worthless hardwood that a successful sawmill cannot even sell. Many assume loneliness has clouded his judgment after retirement. Others believe he must be storing the wood for winter heating, although the quantity is far beyond anything one household could ever use. No one bothers asking him directly because Elias has always been known as a quiet man who rarely explains himself. What none of them realize is that he is not collecting discarded lumber at all. He is quietly collecting opportunity, one truckload at a time, long before anyone else can recognize its value. If you enjoy stories about ordinary people discovering extraordinary possibilities where everyone else sees only failure, then you've come to the right place. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, because this community continues to grow thanks to people who appreciate determination, patience, and practical wisdom. Now let's discover how a retired engineer transformed a forgotten stream of industrial waste into a business that would eventually earn well into six figures without ever chasing trends or making headlines. Elias Mercer inherited the property from his father in the early 1990s, although the land itself had belonged to the Mercer family since 1961. For more than 40 years, he worked as a civil engineer specializing in rural bridge rehabilitation, flood control projects, and county infrastructure, spending most of his career solving structural problems that few people ever noticed unless something went wrong. Precision, patience, and long-term thinking defined his professional life. After retiring, many of his former colleagues expected him to move closer to Louisville where his son and grandchildren lived, leaving the farm behind for developers eager to divide it into residential lots. Instead, Elias stayed exactly where he was. He maintained the fields himself, repaired every fence by hand, paid the modest property taxes without complaint, and politely declined multiple offers from investors who insisted the land was worth far more as housing than farmland. Around Hartwell County, he was respected for his career, but rarely considered remarkable. People viewed him as a retired engineer, enjoying a quiet life, someone who preferred repairing old machinery over attending community meetings or seeking attention. Ironically, that quiet reputation became one of his greatest advantages, because almost nobody paid enough attention to question what he was building before it was too late to copy. The lumber mill belonged to a second-generation owner named Graham Whitaker, whose family had operated Whitaker Timber Company for more than 40 years just a few miles down the highway from Elias's farm. Graham knew very little about Elias beyond his reputation as a retired engineer, but he knew one important fact about the Mercer property. The long gravel easement running along the western edge of the land provided more than enough space for temporary storage, making it an ideal location for materials his mill could not profitably process. Every month, the mill handled thousands of board feet of hardwood destined for cabinet manufacturers, flooring suppliers, and large construction distributors that demanded perfectly straight lumber with consistent grain and identical dimensions. Whenever an oak log revealed dramatic curves, oversized growth rings, or wide natural live edges, it immediately became a production problem rather than a valuable asset. Those unusual sections required slower drying, careful handling, and buyers willing to appreciate character instead of uniformity. Large commercial customers rarely wanted such material, and keeping it occupied valuable storage space that generated no revenue. After calculating the cost of transporting the rejected slabs to a landfill year after year, Graham proposed an unusually simple arrangement. Instead of paying disposal fees every week, his company would haul the unwanted oak slabs directly to the Mercer property. Elias could keep every piece free of charge, use as much as he wished, and in return the mill would eliminate both transportation costs and unnecessary waste. To Graham, it was merely an efficient business decision. To Elias, it sounded like an opportunity he did not yet fully understand. He accepted without hesitation, not because he already had a detailed plan, but because decades spent designing bridges had taught him that valuable materials should never be discarded until every possibility had been explored. Good engineering, he often believed, began with respecting the resources already available rather than constantly searching for new ones. During the first several months, the growing stacks of oak remained untouched, resting quietly beneath the changing Kentucky seasons, while wind and sunlight slowly pulled moisture from the dense hardwood. At first, Elias simply observed them, making notes almost as though he were studying another engineering project. Some slabs twisted dramatically after only a few weeks, while others remained remarkably stable. Several developed deep surface cracks, yet neighboring boards from the same delivery stayed perfectly intact. His professional instincts pushed him to search for explanations instead of accepting random outcomes. That curiosity gradually introduced him to the complex science of wood drying. He discovered that kiln drying forced moisture from lumber inside carefully controlled heated chambers, reducing drying time from many months to only a matter of days. Air drying demanded extraordinary patience, often requiring close to a year for every inch of thickness, but it preserved much of the wood's natural color, internal stability, and distinctive grain. Oak proved especially challenging because its dense cellular structure trapped moisture deep inside the timber. If dried too rapidly, internal stresses formed long before the surface appeared ready, creating cracks that permanently weakened the board. He also learned the difference between flat-sawn and quarter-sawn oak. Quarter-sawn lumber, cut nearly perpendicular to the tree's annual growth rings, produced striking ray flex prized by fine furniture makers while offering greater dimensional stability. However, producing those cuts consumed additional time and reduced manufacturing efficiency, making them unattractive for high-volume commercial production. Maple, by contrast, dried faster, moved less during seasonal humidity changes, and fit modern manufacturing schedules far more easily. The very characteristics that frustrated large sawmills were precisely the qualities that made carefully selected oak so desirable to skilled craftsmen. Elias found the contradiction fascinating. Throughout his engineering career, he had repeatedly seen that the strongest structures often required the greatest patience to build. And now the same principle seemed to exist inside the timber itself. Still, understanding theory proved far easier than mastering practice. Several stacks developed severe checking because he placed them directly on the ground. Others warped after receiving uneven afternoon sunlight. Eventually, he began separating each layer with carefully measured wooden spacers to improve airflow, adjusting the height and spacing almost as though he were designing miniature structural systems. Every mistake became another lesson, and every corrected mistake brought him one step closer to understanding a material he had spent an entire lifetime overlooking, despite working around construction projects for decades. Nearly a year after the first truckload arrived, Elias finally decided the time had come to test everything he had been learning. Rather than beginning with an ambitious project, he chose something simple, a coffee table for the reading room inside his old farmhouse. He carefully selected one of the widest oak slabs from the earliest deliveries, believing it had finished drying naturally. For an entire weekend, he worked patiently with hand planes, sanding blocks and borrowed power tools until the rough surface slowly revealed rich golden grain hidden beneath years of weathered bark. When the shaping was complete, he purchased a commercial finishing oil from the local hardware store and confidently applied the first coat, expecting the wood to glow evenly across its surface. Instead, Dark blotches appeared almost immediately. Some areas absorbed far too much oil, while others barely changed at all, leaving an uneven finish that made months of careful preparation seem completely wasted. Frustrated, Elias considered cutting the slab into firewood and abandoning the idea altogether. He had solved complicated engineering failures throughout his career, yet a single piece of oak had defeated him more thoroughly than many bridge calculations ever had. Fortunately, fate intervened before he gave up. One afternoon, his longtime neighbor, 80-year-old Benjamin Carter, happened to drive past the property on his way home. Benjamin had spent more than 4 decades building custom furniture before arthritis forced him into retirement. Seeing fresh sawdust covering the porch, he stopped to investigate. Elias quietly showed him the ruined tabletop, expecting criticism. Instead, Benjamin smiled gently, ran his hand across the uneven surface, and spoke words Elias would never forget. Wood never argues with you, Elias. It simply waits until you're willing to understand it. The timber already knows what it wants to become. Our job is to stop forcing it to become something else. The sentence sounded almost philosophical, yet everything Benjamin taught afterward was remarkably practical. He demonstrated how raw oak should first be sealed with a light sanding sealer before accepting oil, explained why grain direction influenced absorption, showed how moisture trapped beneath the surface could affect every layer of finish, and reminded Elias that patience mattered far more than natural talent. Elias listened carefully, filling an old engineering notebook with observations just as he had done throughout his professional life. His second attempt produced a far better surface, although the edges still wandered slightly because his cutting blade had not been sharpened correctly. Benjamin returned the following week carrying an old router and a homemade straight guide that he had built decades earlier. He patiently demonstrated how to true a live edge without destroying its natural character, emphasizing that precision should never erase individuality. Elias practiced the technique repeatedly for weeks, making small corrections with each attempt until every cut became steadier and every finished surface reflected growing confidence rather than uncertainty. Progress arrived slowly, almost invisibly, through hundreds of small improvements instead of one dramatic breakthrough. Nearly another year passed before Elias completed a dining table that finally matched the image he had imagined from the beginning. The broad live edge remained beautifully intact. The warm amber grains shimmered beneath multiple hand-rubbed coats of oil, and every joint reflected the careful precision that decades of engineering had quietly instilled within him. Shortly afterward, an old family friend named Linda Foster visited for dinner. She admired the table throughout the evening before finally asking whether Elias would consider building one for her own home. Unsure whether he could successfully reproduce the result, he agreed to charge only enough to cover the hardware and finishing supplies because he viewed the project as another opportunity to learn rather than a business transaction. When Linda's table was finished, she proudly shared photographs with friends and relatives. Those images eventually reached a homeowner in Lexington, searching for handcrafted furniture with genuine character. Soon afterward, a young couple renovating an old farmhouse contacted Elias with another request. Then another inquiry followed. Elias never created a website, never purchased advertising, and never introduced himself as a furniture maker. He simply continued approaching every commission with the same deliberate patience Benjamin had taught him. Customers quickly recognized that each piece carried something increasingly rare in a world of mass production. One client, after running his fingers across the flowing live edge of a finished console table, smiled and quietly remarked, "This doesn't feel like new furniture. It feels like it already belongs to a family." In that moment, Elias realized people were not merely buying oak. They were investing in craftsmanship, patience, and the quiet story hidden within every imperfect piece of timber that someone else had once dismissed as worthless. The true turning point arrived almost 3 years after the first truck had rolled onto the Mercer property, carrying what everyone else considered worthless timber. One afternoon, an interior designer from Nashville named Victoria Langford was searching for a custom reception desk for a boutique lodge being restored in eastern Tennessee when she came across several photographs of Elias's handcrafted tables shared by previous clients. Intrigued by the distinctive live-edge oak and the remarkable attention to detail, she decided to drive to Kentucky herself rather than relying on phone calls or catalogs, expecting to find a retired hobbyist working inside a small garage. She instead discovered carefully organized rows of naturally curing oak stacked beneath open-sided shelters, a converted dairy barn transformed into a clean woodworking shop, and an elderly engineer who spoke about moisture content, grain orientation, and structural movement with the same confidence most architects reserve for blueprints. To Victoria, it became immediately obvious that Elias was not simply building furniture. He was solving engineering problems hidden inside every piece of wood before turning them into works of craftsmanship. Without hesitation, she placed an order for 6 custom pieces, including a large reception desk, conference tables, and matching console cabinets for the new lodge. It was by far the largest commission Elias had ever accepted, and for the first time since beginning his unexpected journey, genuine fear replaced quiet confidence. He carefully calculated the schedule, using the disciplined planning habits developed throughout decades of engineering projects. Yet even his experience failed to account for the countless hours required to hand-finish 6 large pieces while working completely alone. As the delivery deadline drew closer, long days stretched into late nights. Sleep became shorter, mistakes became more costly, and the pressure of disappointing his first major commercial client weighed heavily on his mind. Benjamin Carter, now well into his 80s, noticed the exhaustion written across Elias's face during one of his regular visits. After quietly listening to his concerns, the old craftsman smiled and offered another lesson that would shape the next chapter of Elias's life. A good builder knows the difference between doing everything himself and building something that lasts. Pride builds walls, trust builds workshops. Those simple words finally convinced Elias to seek help. He hired a younger craftsman named Nathan Brooks, a former furniture factory supervisor who had recently lost his job after the company relocated production overseas. Nathan possessed speed, physical strength, and years of manufacturing experience. Elias contributed careful judgment, design discipline, and an uncompromising eye for quality. Their skills complemented one another almost immediately. Together, they completed Victoria's entire commission on schedule without sacrificing the standards that had earned Elias his growing reputation. The lodge opened successfully, and visitors constantly asked who had built the remarkable furniture, filling its entrance hall and gathering rooms. Victoria gladly shared his name with designers, architects, and business owners throughout the region. Before long, another hospitality group planning boutique properties across several southern states specifically requested furniture crafted by the retired engineer from Kentucky. What had begun as a weekly delivery of discarded oak slowly evolved into a respected workshop known for transforming overlooked timber into heirloom-quality furniture. Within 4 years of accepting that first load of rejected slabs, the modest barn behind the Mercer farmhouse had grown into a thriving business, generating well into 6 figures annually, while providing meaningful work for several local craftsmen whose traditional skills might otherwise have disappeared. Yet remarkably, very little changed about Elias's Thursday mornings. Every week, the familiar flatbed truck still turned onto the same gravel road. Graham Whitaker still called whenever an unusually beautiful oak log produced irregular slabs that commercial buyers refused to purchase. Elias still stood outside with a cup of black coffee, watching another load of imperfect timber being stacked neatly beside the fence. The wood itself had never changed. It was still rough, still irregular, and still rejected by almost everyone else. The only thing that had truly changed was the man waiting to receive it. Years earlier, he had looked at those slabs through the disciplined eyes of an engineer searching for hidden potential beneath apparent flaws. Over time, he learned to see something even greater. Every crack represented character rather than failure. Every crooked edge carried a story impossible to reproduce by machine. Every inconvenience concealed an opportunity reserved only for those patient enough to uncover it. Visitors frequently asked Elias how he had managed to build such an extraordinary business from materials everyone else ignored. He would simply smile, run his hand gently across the weathered edge of another oak slab, waiting its turn in the workshop, and repeat a belief he had come to live by throughout both his engineering career and his unexpected second profession. The greatest value is rarely hidden because it is rare. It is hidden because most people lose patience before they learn how to recognize it. He never discovered a fortune buried inside discarded oak. He discovered it inside persistence, careful observation, countless failures, The quiet wisdom of an old master craftsman and the willingness to return every Thursday morning long before anyone else could imagine what those forgotten pieces of timber might someday become. If this story has changed the way you look at the overlooked things in life, remember to subscribe and join us as we continue uncovering remarkable stories hidden beneath ordinary surfaces. Sometimes the world's greatest treasures are simply waiting for someone patient enough to recognize them before everyone else does.